Please be seated. Thank you so much. I hope the rating will restrain itself without a TRO being issued against you. Okay, so to your beloved Dean, Maria Mendoza, and of course I thank Dr. Domingo for that kind introduction. Professor Emeritus Dr. Jose Abuela, the administrators, officials, employees of the University of the Philippines National College of Public Administration and Governance, esteemed members of the faculty, the members of the graduating class of 2015, their parents and loved ones, ladies and gentlemen, magandang hapon po sa inyo lahat. Magandang hapon po. It is quite an honor to be invited by this esteemed institution to be the keynote speaker for this recognition Rites. And the kind words that were imparted in your letter invitation gain a deeper meaning and bring me greater honor and pleasure, knowing I am among those who devoted years of their lives to defining, studying, and developing the principles of exemplary public administration. And what I got was high praise indeed for me, who more or less was serendipitously and unexpectedly given the opportunity to enter public service. And the theme of today's event, challenges to exemplary public administration, calls to mind a problem we have been having in the office lately. I don't know if the problem is specific to the department or is being experienced by others under contract with the same subscriber, but we have been having trouble with our internet connection. The truth behind the saying that you don't miss the water until the well runs dry is never better displayed than when we're going about our usual tasks, which these days inevitably require some use of the internet, especially for virtually instantaneously sending urgently needed documents, you suddenly see that little yellow triangle, an exclamation point where your network connection indicator is, indicating you have been disconnected from cyberspace. It is at that moment that you become painfully aware of the scores of ways you have taken for granted by which an internet connection has made your life easy and which are all now beyond our reach. Suddenly, attaching a 900 KB sized file to your email becomes a stressful exercise in patience and suspense as you wait and see whether the trouble will resolve itself or would require a phone call to the IT department, or worse, a phone call by them to the service provider, only to be told that the latter is working on the problem, and no, they can't say how long it will take. I imagine it is the same frustration that Globe and Smart subscribers felt when they couldn't send or receive a simple text message to or from subscribers or the other due to some interconnection issue. Suddenly, the public is in a clamor, which from what I recall, prompted the National Telecommunications Commission to intervene. Like internet and telecommunication services, public administration is intrinsically service and performance or output oriented. In fact, Woodrow Wilson, who would go on to become the 28th President of the United States, published an essay on the study of administration while he was a professor at Bryn Mawr, saying that, quote, "It is the object of administrative study to discover first what government can properly and successfully do, and secondly, how it can do these proper things with the utmost possible efficiency and at the least possible cost, either of money or of energy, end of quote. So too, like the trouble with internet and telecommunication services, the challenge to exemplary public administration are largely due to certain forms of disconnection, at least as far as I have observed based on my own experience in public service these past 7 years. First, and perhaps the most obvious, there is a disconnect between what public officials and administrators are mandated to do on the one hand, which by the definition of what are the goals of the field of public administration is the improvement of the democratic values of equality, justice, security, efficiency, and effectiveness of public service, and on the other, the motivation to make decisions in consideration of debts they incurred in order to attain and retain their position and power. While there is no dispute that the public is entitled to their complete and full commitment to the improvement of these democratic values, the reality is much more jaded than that. For as long as there are those who attain their positions by bartering for votes and favors, their loyalty will always be divided between the Filipino people who supposedly elected them and the people who got them elected, which unfortunately is not necessarily one and the same. This form of disconnect between the weight of duty and the weight of debts and favors owed is a blight on public administration, but it replaces good intentions, good policies, good judgment, and the ability to make the right choices with slavery to corruption and what some euphemistically call transactional form of governance, where everything from lucrative government tasks or government deals, key or influential government posts, even those that should be shielded from partisan politics, even silence, convenient versions of the quote-unquote truth and impunity can be bought and sold for the right price. That's how government officials find the gumption and the motivation to blatantly steal from public coffers, to shamelessly rig procurement processes, to loftily believe that they can get away with the slaughter of more than 50 people in broad daylight. After all, people who have sold their souls to the devil in exchange for power, money, and influence can hardly be expected to feel any shame, even while they retain the capability to feign and claim innocence. While it is true that corruption has been endemic to the bureaucracy, it once was and could again get worse. There are those to whom corruption itself is their chosen mode of governance. That is the first most obvious challenge to exemplary public administration. But the future, I believe, is not bleak. In fact, the future for Philippine public administration is very promising because while the present administration has admittedly had its share of troubles, it has for the most part proved that corruption can be made to pay and perhaps eventually curtailed. The very election of President Benigno S. Aquino III proved that when one's mandate comes directly from the people and was obtained through the trust and confidence in the principles that a candidate stands for and not bought through the trite but nonetheless terrible trio of guns, brooms, and goals, we can eliminate the disconnect between mandate and motivation. There is only one motivation: discharge one's mandate. I, for myself, can speak from experience how liberating it is to not be beholden to anyone for being appointed to the posts I have thus far held. By whatever convergence of serendipitous and fateful circumstances, I was appointed as chairperson of the Commission on Human Rights and thereafter as Secretary of Justice under two different and politically opposed administrations. without having lobbied for it and beyond, and in fact, against any expectations I had. It is, in truth, still surreal to me to look back as to how I suddenly found myself appointed to a position as critical as that of Secretary of Justice by a president-elect who was personally unknown to me, and vice versa, to say the least. I would guess that I shared the assumption of even the most modestly politically aware persons in such a post would be given to an ally and or as a reward to someone who was instrumental during the campaign. But that's not how President Aquino made his decision. And here I am. I stand before you, not just because I am the Secretary of Justice, but because I was given the unexpected opportunity to serve the public under ideal circumstances, where the only expectation the President has from me is to discharge my mandate faithfully and with integrity. And I made the best of that opportunity as I could by making difficult decisions in the face of countless obstacles, threats, and even attempts at character assassination based on what I believe to be right, not on what is profitable or convenient or the path of least resistance. Had things unfolded differently, I would say that it is fair to wonder whether we would still have uncovered the things we know now. For instance, would Ben Berlouin and the other whistleblowers have had the courage and sufficient trust and commitment and confidence in the Department of Justice to approach the Secretary with the revelations about a grand conspiracy to defraud the public involving some of the highest-ranking government officials? After all, that trust and confidence were not easily established overnight. They were built over the years by proving that it is possible for a government official to discharge his or her mandate without fear or favor. And it hadn't been easy. Far from it. In fact, I recall being warned by someone to tread lightly in relation to the PDAP investigation because, according to him, I could potentially, quote unquote, bring the government to its knees. There were difficult decisions that some people tried to make it even more difficult, with arguments that essentially implied that the Filipino people are best served by keeping them ignorant of the truth. Some did more than imply. Some have tried to railroad the truth by filing cases against me and other public officials who are only discharging their mandate or by using the legal and mass media machinery to impede or restrain fact-finding efforts, as if the Filipino are too weak to handle the truth, as if the constitutional principles of accountability meant nothing, as if being a popular public figure with a high enough political office and family members all over the government structure is above the law and the Constitution. I admit that it is not always easy to challenge these powers that be, but it can be done. The challenge is for you, as those learned in the ways of public administration, and for all of us as ordinary citizens, to have the wisdom, integrity, moral fiber, and fortitude to make the right choices and demand them from those bound to serve. Therein lies a second form of disconnect. The disconnect between knowing the traits and the kind of leaders we need and deserve, and the manner by which we select our leaders. There is a reason why charisma is one of the factors by which political pundits weigh the prospects of a candidate, because historically, Filipino people make decisions based on what they perceive to be the image the candidate projects. After all, how and why else would a candidate who was born to wealth, power, and influence would have wanted to project herself during the campaign in the image of one of the masses' beloved actress who was known for her dirt-poor beginnings of similar roles in the movies? For so long, Philippine elections have virtually been sarsuelas, with candidates singing, dancing, and catering to the entertainment whims of the masses rather than engaging in substantive information campaign and debates about their policies, programs, track record, and concrete plans for the next several years. Candidates engage in these contrived activities not because they particularly want to, but because such strategies have been historically known to work. Elections are won by those who can build around themselves the most compelling cult of personality. Yet, it is not necessarily because the electorate do not know what kind of leaders they want. It is not as if they truly believe that a nation's problems can be solved when the president randomly breaks into a song and dance number. And these days, it is increasingly obvious that it is not because they are apathetic. People do care about choosing the best candidate. It is no longer a problem of apathy, but as I observe, a disconnect between knowing the kind of leader they want and how they go about selecting such leader. For some reason, people still go for the charismatic leader or the one with the closest affiliation to a charismatic personality, forgetting or not knowing, perhaps, that Adolf Hitler himself was a master orator who oozed of charisma, forgetting that age-old adage that you cannot judge a book by its cover, that the best and most successful criminals and con artists are those who don't look, sound, or act like criminals and con artists. The key to eliminating this disconnect is to de-emphasize looks, personality, or that indefinable factor called charisma, and instead put greater emphasis on substantive factors like track record, their position in important issues, their exhibited propensity for truth, as opposed to lies or evasions, and discerning, based on their acts and utterances, whether they are in the path towards the tuwid na daan with integrity, accountability, and through ethical administration, or on the path of consolidating absolute power in themselves, their family members, and their cohorts. The third kind of disconnect, ladies and gentlemen, is the communication between the public and the public administrators. We speak of transparency and participation, yet we still get cases where public hearings are being done just for compliance and not to truly obtain the views of the public. Or there is a disconnect when rehearsed and professionally crafted words fail to connect with the public. For my part and my own personal choice, I always speak for myself and not through mouthpieces. It is for the same reason why, despite being criticized quite rudely at times of quote-unquote talking too much, I choose to be open and direct. For it is important for me to know that people can tell whether I mean what I say and I'm saying what I mean. When you look a person in the eye, there is a better chance of ascertaining where the script and the spin ends and where the truth begins. The more a person attempts to dissemble and speak pretty words, the harder is to convince the people of one's sincerity. I think, therefore, that there is a need to bridge this disconnect. It is a challenge for public administration because it is not just about government being effective and successful in serving the public, it is also important for the people to understand and know just what makes it effective and successful. And the fourth kind of disconnect, I believe, is perhaps the most important to mention on this occasion. For it is one where you, as the academics, the professionals, and the ones learned in the field of public administration are in the best position to address. I believe that the first three forms of disconnect I mentioned are rooted in one important gap, an educational gap among the citizenry about what exemplary public administration means, what it entitles them to, and what is expected of them. For public administration is not a one-way street. John F. Kennedy has famously said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Everybody can say this, but on the contrary, I believe both are valid questions to ask. As much as we want people to act honorably, because we believe and hope that it is in the nature of human beings to be honorable and morally upright, we cannot rely on the variations in individual person's nature and the effects thereon of environmental factors, and simply expect them to do what is right and to give the people what is their due under the social contract. Sometimes, to be sure to get your due, you have to know what, when, where, why, and how to demand it. After all, the social contract is a reciprocal contract that entails reciprocal rights and obligations. Thus, it is as important that people know what the state can and should do for the people as it is for the people to know what the state can and will expect from them as their part of the bargain. For instance, when we speak of certain forms of graft and corruption, it really does take two to tango. As Secretary of Justice, I am on the receiving end of reports that this prosecutor or that official, whether from the DOJ main or from our attached or constituent agencies, is on the take. Yet, those who are willing to come forward and report attempts to extort are relatively few and far between, with huge ramifications for the integrity of the institution. I believe that there are values, democratic values, including good governance and productive citizenship values, that ought to be taught as part of basic education as early as possible. It is folly to think that these are the domain of those who are old enough to vote, or worse, that it is the domain of public officials or public administrators and academics such as yourselves. On the contrary, I firmly believe that it is the right and obligation of all Filipinos, and to wait for them to reach tertiary level or graduate level students or studies to impart and inculcate these values into their system is too little, too late. Is it any secret that one of the objections to the Sangguniang Kabataan system is that instead of gaining useful and gainful experience in public service and administration, the observation and fear is that the youth are instead being exposed to corruption and thus themselves being corrupted at such an early age. The youth, the future generation, are participants in society from the moment they are born, and they learn things, good and bad, as soon as their cognitive functions are developed enough to allow it, or to allow it. I believe in the power of education and the power of countering bad habits that they may learn at home or out in public with lessons and exercises in good judgment learned and developed within a proper educational setting, perhaps inside the classroom environment. Is it any wonder that our citizens are prone to succumb to cults of personality when their education about our history and our society is about memorizing names and dates and regurgitating them during exams? They know the names, but do they know the deeds well enough to know what these people did right and did wrong, or what they could have done differently, and what could have been the consequences of those choices? The key words, I believe, are consequences and choices. It was once said that, quote, "We all make choices, but in the end our choices make us," end quote. Indeed, we are the consequences of our choices and our actions. If we want a strong nation, we must build a strong citizenry. To build a strong citizenry, they must learn to choose the paths that will make them stronger. To learn to choose it well, they must learn about consequences. They must learn the consequence of voting based on charisma instead of substance. They must learn the consequence and they must learn the consequence of corrupting the system. And that is my vision. Exemplary public administration is something that is built from the ground up. To expect an adult to make the right decisions when his or her time comes, the foundation for making the right choice should be as much a part of him or her as his or her own DNA. I believe in education as a powerful foundation and building material from which such ideal can be crafted and realized. Woodrow Wilson considered public administration as a science, as a field of scholarly study and not just empirical application. In his words, he said, quote, "This is why there should be a science of administration which shall seek to straighten the paths of government, to make its business less unbusinesslike, to strengthen and purify its organization, and to crown its duties with dutifulness." End of quote. I subscribe to this view and go on further. It is the science that should be made part of our basic education. I think you, the graduates, are in the best position to craft a proper curriculum and methodology to achieve this gradually and surely. And with that, I congratulate the graduates of the National College of Public Administration and Governance for your achievements thus far, and I challenge you not just to rise to greater heights of exemplary public administration in your own right, but also to assist the rest of the nation in doing so. I thank you for the opportunity to share some of my advocacies and experience in public service. I'm reminded of what Margaret Whitley, a management consultant who studies organizational behavior, once said, quote, "Without reflection, we go blindly on our way, creating more unintended consequences and failing to achieve anything useful." End of quote. And finally, I'd like to part with this last note. Life in the public service can be as taxing as it is fulfilling. Decisions are not always as easy to discern as between black and white. No one can make those decisions for you. When the going gets tough, just know that when you do what is right based on what is within the bounds of the law and morality, you cannot go wrong. And in the end, all the hardships are worth it. Cultivate a conscience. It will be your most loyal ally. Maraming salamat po.